Hey there, Tom Perazzo here from agaragetime.com, and today I want to share with you 4 effective methods to strip the paint off your car and prepare it for a new finish. You know, my car went from looking like this to this.
Garage time.
And the methods I use are mechanical, the strip-it discs, wire wheels. Number 2 are chemical paint strippers. Number 3 is blasting media, several different types. And number 4 is dipping the whole thing into a chemical. Each one of those techniques has its own drawbacks and advantages. So I want to share with you my thoughts on how it might help you. For the exterior of my car, I used methods 1 and 2, which is mechanical stripping and chemical stripping. So it's important to tape up the seams so that the stripper does not get anywhere in cavities you don't want it to be. Here I've applied the stripper and I've covered it with some plastic. The plastic helps on horizontal surfaces to keep it from evaporating. Makes it work a little bit stronger. Today's paint strippers are not the same quality that they used to be. You got to let it sit for a long time before it will start to bubble. Once it bubbles, I use a Bondo scraper to get the majority of it off. And then I'm using a strip-it disc. This is on a Makita Sander. The disc starts at about 8 inches in diameter, and it's a very coarse material that sort of picks up the wet paint left from the stripper and just throws it off. There is a little bit of dust, but for the most part, because the paint has been so soft and it is tender, it tends to just ball up and go on the floor. The hood on this car has several layers of paint, 14 layers of paint, so it's not going to bare metal on the first pass. I'm going to have to add more stripper. This is what the fender looks like after 1 pass. There are still some patches of paint that I could put a little more paint stripper, especially on the vertical surfaces. Here's the passenger fender. Still needs a little bit more stripper and more time with the strip-it disc. Here it is after pass 2, already looking pretty shiny. Stayed away from the seams and anything that might trap the acid of the paint stripper. The strip-it disc is a pretty coarse material. It leaves a good bite on the metal. It's like an 80 grit finish, but it doesn't remove metal. It doesn't create sparks or any kind of removal of the metal. It's pretty safe to use by anybody. Once the metal is nice and shiny, I like to neutralize it because it does have a chemical residue on it. I like to neutralize it with hot water and soap. Here I am using a red Scotch-Brite pad and just cleaning the surface and wiping it down with a paper towel. Once that paper towel is dirty, you fold it over, keep going, try to get as many contaminants off the surface as possible. An extra precaution, maybe it's not super necessary. I live in a dry climate, but I'm using a heat gun to evaporate any of that water I left on the surface so it doesn't flash rust. Then I go over it with my DA sander, 80 grit, to smooth it out, make a nice uniform finish, get ready for epoxy primer right away. You don't want to wait too long for the epoxy primer. You want to catch it before it flash rusts. In some climates, that could be in about an hour. So here's the car perfectly cleaned. Now it's time for epoxy primer. Definitely use wax and grease remover. Here I'm using a Harbor Freight spray gun. It's slow, but it gets the job done. This footage is sped up. Now the car is protected as I work on other parts of the car. Another mechanical method of stripping is the wire wheel. Now, the strip-it disc, even though it doesn't get clogged up with paint, it can get clogged up with undercoating. So I like to use the wire wheel on the end of an angle grinder to get the undercoating off. It's safe on the metal, but it does create a huge mess. This is after a little bit of strip it disc time, perfectly clean metal. Ready for epoxy primer? Now some parts of the car don't require to go to bare metal. Here in the trunk area, I was down to factory paint, so I did a combination of sanding and prepping the metal to blend it in. Some guys will use just pure sandpaper on their car, and a 36 grit, 40 grit paper is pretty aggressive. It will take the paint off, but it also removes a little bit of metal. Plus, those discs can clog up. These are the tools of choice: wire wheel, strip it disc. The strip it discs are a little hard to find, but they are available. I'll put a link in the description below. The big drawbacks to the mechanical method is it is highly labor intensive. You will get tired, your arms will get tired, and it just is messy. You have a lot of cleanup to do. I'll cover this more in the conclusions, but it is a safe method. That's about enough of the mechanical and the chemical methods. Now let's move on to blasting. Now I'm not set up for heavy duty blasting like some of the commercial outfits are, but I do like using the spot blaster in some areas. This particular area was pitted, and it also had some damage due to some spot welds that I had to drill out. So to get inside those nooks and crannies, the spot blaster does a great job. And once again, as soon as the metal has been cleaned with wax and grease remover, you've got to paint it right away with some epoxy primer. That's going to protect it from rusting again, even before it will flash rust. Here I'm just brushing it on. Perfectly fine to brush it on. This guy's going after his entire car, and it certainly is doable. You need a lot of air pressure and you need a lot of space.
If you have never sandblasted an entire car before, it is a mother trucker of a job.
There's also dustless blasting, which is a combination of abrasive media and water. So it's pretty effective. It has a less propensity to warp the panels because the water actually cools the metal, but you do need to be careful. Dry ice blasting. This is actually frozen CO2, and it is very controllable. It doesn't leave a residue, and it will take layer off by layer. It's pretty delicate, even on things like emblems. The drawbacks to blasting, I mean, there's several different types of blasting, but if you're using the media like walnut shells or sand, it will get stuck in your car. In some cases, if you can't get it out, if it's in a hidden cavity, it can actually hold moisture and cause rust from the inside out. So you really should either cut into areas that are concealed or tape them up so the sand doesn't get inside. You can use soda, but soda needs to be neutralized as well. Even if it gets into cavities or seams, it's really important that it doesn't leach out again in the future. It's an alkaline chemical. The dry ice blasting is great. It takes off layer by layer. It's perfect for high-end restorations that are looking for factory markings to unveil certain materials layered on top of each other. It's really good for investigative work. A little bit slow, and it's very expensive. That's an overview of the blasting. Now let's move on to the dipping. One form of dipping that I've used is electrolysis. The entire part is dipped in the solution, and I use washing soda and also electricity to remove rust only from the surface. It's very effective at pulling out the rust. It does leave a black residue on the surface that needs to be wire wheeled anyways, but the outcome is really nice for pitted surfaces and irregular surfaces. I don't like using this method for seams for the same reason I mentioned in the blasting area. Of course, you can dip your entire car into solution. This is a hot tank followed by an acid dip, and it's going to go into everywhere you can, and it's going to eat all the rust and paint and anything that's in there. It also has to have some mechanical vibration. This is a pressure washer to get most of those contaminants and leftover surface stuff off. Flooding seams, you're getting moisture in places that really are no longer protected. So this process works well, especially for highly rusty cars. One drawback is, you got to treat it right away, and you got to prevent any leaching from happening in the future. Any of that acid that gets trapped in those seams could potentially migrate out after you've already painted your car. So cleanliness and attention to detail is really important for dipping. Make sure you're trusting a professional. This Porsche went through several baths: an alkaline bath, an acid bath, a neutralizing bath, and then finally an electro coat. So this process requires a lot of skill. The chemicals are going to attack different areas of the car at different rates. The roof, for instance, is going to be relatively easy to attack. The chemical is going to be right on the surface. Other hidden cavities and seam sealed areas are going to act more slowly. The seam sealer is difficult to remove with chemicals because it's a rubbery kind of component. And if it does get through there, it's not going to work at the same rate. So if you get it all, the seam sealer out, you might be etching too much of the roof or the exterior panels. Also, with dipping, you have to be concerned with capturing air inside the car. Porsches have a lot of hidden cavities and channels, so unless you're rotating the car inside the solution, you're going to be trapping air in there. And if the solution can't contact all surfaces of the internal cavities, you have a partially treated, partially untreated interface, and that can cause corrosion in the future too. So no method is 100% perfect. It really depends on the situation of what kind of car you have and whether it's completely been cleaned or only partially cleaned. This is a brand new car being galvanized. And if you notice the way it's pushed into the solution and pulled out of the solution, it's really difficult for air to get trapped in this because it goes through a full rotisserie motion. This is for a brand new car prior to seam sealer. They've got it all worked out. That's a quick overview of some of the methods that I've used on my car. Obviously, you need to experiment and do your own research. So I recommend, checking with the primer manufacturer and see what they say. In my experience, most of the primers work best on clean metal, not phosphated films or residues or salts. So you really have to be careful about some of the claims some of these conditioners are making and whether or not it'll work with your primer. Also, most of the primer manufacturers recommend a roughed up surface, usually 80 grit. So if you've done soda blasting or ice blasting and you got a really smooth surface, well, chances are you're gonna have to rough it up again anyways. So that's kind of why I prefer the mechanical methods. This is the strip it disc. It's not perfect. If you have a really rusty car, this disc will remove some rust, but it will not go deep into pits. If your car's pitted, then maybe blasting is a good solution for you. Maybe blasting a portion of the car and not the entire car is a good solution for you. If you don't want to overexert yourself, or you have a bad back or a bad elbow or something, potentially you could just hire a day laborer to do some of the grunt work, because that's basically what this is. It's a pretty safe method to have almost anyone do it. So don't feel like this won't work for you because you're physically unable. You probably could just hire someone to do it for you. In fact, I might do that next time. And as far as dipping goes, I really only like dipping for small parts, maybe even as big as a gas tank if you're trying to get the internals cleaned out and it's hard to reach. But I don't like the problem with the dipping for me is about the hidden cavities, the air pockets, and the seam sealer. If the car is not rusty, then there's no point in upsetting those seams. I upset seams on my car when I did the seam welding, and I went back and treated it with epoxy primer and tried to get those hidden cavities repaired with some sort of protection. But it is a risk when you upset the factory seams. I'm sure people are going to disagree, and that's totally fine. Please leave a comment below if you disagree, or please leave a comment on your favorite method, because I didn't cover them all. So this is a highly debated topic, and that's why I made this video. And if you're interested in more details about my car, this video is put together from about 6 or 7 different videos on my channel. So if you're interested in more of the nitty-gritty details on my particular Porsche, I'm going to put links to all those videos in the description below. Thank you guys for watching.